To fully deconstruct the sensationalized but fundamentally rooted claim that an overcomplicated torpedo bomber achieved the highest kill ratio of any United States warplane during the Second World War, one must first engage in a rigorous process of historical and linguistic clarification. When military historians and aviation enthusiasts discuss a kill ratio, the metric almost universally applied is the air-to-air combat exchange rate between fighter aircraft, a statistical arena utterly dominated by the Grumman F-6F Hellcat with its staggering, officially documented ratio of 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every one lost in aerial combat. However, when examining the profoundly impactful, often misunderstood legacy of the Grumman TBF Avenger, and its General Motors-built twin, the TBM Avenger, the definition of kill ratio must be radically expanded and recalibrated from the dogfights of the stratosphere to the brutal, mathematical attrition of anti-shipping and anti-submarine warfare. The assertion that the Avenger was the deadliest American aircraft is not predicated upon fighter sweeps, but rather on its unparalleled, verifiable record as the supreme ship killer of the 20th century, directly responsible for the destruction of 12 enemy aircraft carriers, 6 heavily armored battleships including the mythological super battleships Yamato and Musashi, and approximately 30 Axis submarines. To understand how an aircraft initially dismissed by bureaucratic critics as hopelessly overweight, aerodynamically cumbersome, and dangerously overcomplicated achieved this apocalyptic level of maritime destruction, one must undertake a forensic examination of the engineering philosophy of Leroy Grumman, the devastating industrial realities of the Pacific War, and the harsh, unforgiving physics of delivering a 1-ton airborne torpedo against a maneuvering, heavily defended naval vessel. The narrative of the Avenger is not a story of sleek, effortless aerodynamic grace. It is the ultimate industrial triumph of brute force, redundant survivability, and a deliberate, highly controversial embrace of mechanical complexity over simplistic vulnerability. The genesis of this massive, complex machine was born from a state of acute naval desperation. In the late 1930s, the standard torpedo bomber of the United States Navy was the Douglas TBD Devastator. When introduced in 1937, the Devastator was a revolutionary marvel, the Navy's first all-metal, monoplane carrier aircraft. However, aviation technology during the interwar period advanced at a terrifying, exponential rate, and by the time the Japanese Empire struck Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the Devastator was tragically, suicidally obsolete. It was dreadfully slow, lightly armed, possessed a pathetic operational range, and was entirely devoid of modern survivability features like self-sealing fuel tanks or adequate armor plating. The Navy desperately required a replacement, issuing a rigorous specification for a new torpedo bomber that could carry the massive, 2,000-pound Mark 13 aerial torpedo entirely enclosed within an internal bomb bay to reduce aerodynamic drag, possess a powered defensive gun turret to fend off modern fighter interceptors, and feature a drastically extended combat radius. 2 aviation companies responded with prototypes, Chance Vought with the XTB Sea-Wolf, and Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation with the XTBF. Leroy Grumman, a brilliant engineer with a profound understanding of naval requirements, alongside his chief engineer Bill Schwendler, approached the Navy's demands with a philosophy that would come to define their company, affectionately and respectfully known throughout the fleet as the Grumman Iron Works. Grumman did not believe in building fragile, highly tuned racing machines. He believed in building flying tanks, aircraft that prioritized the survival of the highly trained aircrew above absolute peak aerodynamic performance, recognizing that a dead pilot could not fly a fast airplane tomorrow. This philosophy resulted in a prototype that was absolutely colossal. The XTBF was the largest single-engine aircraft produced during the entire conflict, weighing in at nearly 18,000 pounds fully loaded, a staggering mass that immediately drew intense criticism from traditionalists within the Bureau of Aeronautics who argued that such a bloated, complex behemoth would be impossible to safely operate from the pitching, confined wooden flight decks of the era's aircraft carriers. The primary source of this criticism, and the very reason the aircraft was labeled overcomplicated, stemmed from 3 highly sophisticated, radical engineering features incorporated into the Avenger's design: the Santo wing folding mechanism, the powered dorsal gun turret, and the complex internal bomb bay architecture. Because the Avenger was so massive, featuring a wingspan of over 54 feet, it could not physically fit onto the elevators of American aircraft carriers or be efficiently stowed on the hangar deck if the wings remained fixed. Previous aircraft had utilized simple, upward-folding wings, but this design resulted in a high vertical profile that hit the ceilings of the hangar decks and caught crosswinds on the flight deck, making the aircraft dangerously unstable during heavy seas. Leroy Grumman famously solved this massive geometric puzzle using an ordinary pink rubber eraser and a handful of paper clips. By sticking the paper clips into the sides of the eraser at a highly specific, compound angle, he discovered that the wings could be engineered to fold diagonally backward, pivoting at the wing root to lay flat alongside the fuselage. This ingenious mechanism, dubbed the Santo wing, reduced the aircraft's width to a mere 19 feet while keeping its center of gravity incredibly low and stable. However, to execute this hydraulic ballet, the Avenger required a massive, complex network of hydraulic lines, high-pressure pumps, locking pins, and heavily reinforced wing spars. To critics, this complex hydraulic plumbing was a maintenance nightmare waiting to happen in the corrosive, salt spray environment of the Pacific, a highly vulnerable system that, if damaged by enemy fire, could lock the wings in an asymmetrical position, dooming the aircraft. Grumman, however, countered this by heavily over-engineering the hydraulic actuators and providing manual, mechanical fallbacks, ensuring that the sheer utility of doubling a carrier's torpedo bomber complement far outweighed the maintenance burden of the complex mechanism. The second highly controversial, overcomplicated feature was the incorporation of a fully powered, enclosed dorsal gun turret designed by the Grumman team. Prior to the Avenger, defensive rear armament on naval strike aircraft usually consisted of a radio man standing up in an open cockpit, wrestling with a flexible, wind-buffeted machine gun. This was entirely inadequate against modern, fast-moving fighter interceptors like the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0. Grumman designed a heavily framed, electrically and hydraulically powered spherical glass turret that housed a single, lethal 50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun, operated by a dedicated gunner. The turret was a marvel of miniaturized engineering, requiring complex electrical slip rings to transmit power to the rotating assembly, synchronized interrupter gears to prevent the gunner from accidentally shooting off the aircraft's own tail empennage, and highly sensitive hydraulic tracking controls. Critics argued that adding a massive, heavy glass bubble and complex machinery to the rear of the aircraft drastically shifted the center of gravity and added hundreds of pounds of dead weight that degraded the aircraft's speed. Furthermore, the Avenger featured a third crew member, a radio man, bombardier who was situated in the lower belly of the aircraft. This crewman was responsible for operating the complex radio equipment, utilizing the primitive Norden bomb sight during high-altitude horizontal bombing missions, and manning a flexible, rear-firing 30 caliber machine gun known as the Stinger, designed to protect the highly vulnerable lower rear hemisphere of the aircraft during the long, low, slow torpedo run. The intricate interplay of these three crewmen, communicating through an internal intercom system, managing complex electrical, hydraulic, and armament networks, made the Avenger one of the most sophisticated, systems-heavy single-engine aircraft in the world, a stark contrast to the simple, unarmored Japanese Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers it would soon face. The Avenger's combat debut seemed to terrifyingly validate every single criticism leveled by its detractors regarding its complexity and massive size. In early June of 1942, as the American intelligence apparatus deduced that the Imperial Japanese Navy was moving to strike the tiny atoll of Midway, a detachment of 6 brand-new Grumman TBF-1 Avengers, belonging to Torpedo Squadron 8, was rushed to the island's primitive airstrip. The crews were highly inexperienced with the complex new aircraft, having received them only days prior. When the massive Japanese carrier strike force was located, the 6 Avengers launched without fighter escort to attack the fleet. The result was an absolute, unmitigated slaughter. The massive Avengers, forced to fly in a low, straight, predictable line just feet above the ocean's surface to drop their sensitive Mark 13 torpedoes, were swarmed by dozens of highly maneuverable, veteran-piloted Japanese Zero fighters. The complex powered turrets, manned by inexperienced gunners, could not track the agile Japanese interceptors effectively. The aircraft were torn apart by 20mm cannon fire. 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot out of the sky before they could even release their weapons. The sole surviving aircraft, piloted by Ensign Albert Ernest, managed to stagger back to Midway, its hydraulic systems completely shot out, the elevator control cables severed, the turret gunner dead, and the radio man severely wounded. The aircraft landed on one wheel, riddled with over 70 bullet and cannon holes. To the uninitiated observer, the Battle of Midway proved that the Avenger was a massive, vulnerable failure. However, the engineers at Grumman and the senior naval tacticians who examined Ernest's shattered aircraft drew the exact opposite conclusion. The Avenger had not failed, the tactical deployment had failed. Any aircraft, regardless of its design, would have been annihilated without fighter cover against overwhelming odds. But the fact that Ernest's Avenger, despite suffering catastrophic structural and systemic damage that would have instantly vaporized a Devastator or a Japanese Kate, managed to remain airborne and protect its pilot proved that Leroy Grumman's philosophy of redundant, over-engineered survivability was fundamentally sound. The massive structure of the Avenger could absorb an unimaginable amount of punishment. However, the true Achilles heel of the Avenger during the first year of the war was not its aerodynamic complexity, but the horrific, scandalous inadequacy of the weapon it was designed to deliver, the Mark 13 aerial torpedo. The American claim to the highest kill ratio of surface vessels was severely delayed by the utter failure of the Bureau of Ordnance to provide a functional weapon. The Avenger was a highly sophisticated delivery vehicle for a warhead that simply refused to detonate. During the brutal battles around Guadalcanal, the Santa Cruz Islands, and the Solomon Sea, brave Avenger crews flew their massive aircraft through walls of anti-aircraft fire, executing textbook torpedo drops, only to watch in despair as their Mark 13 torpedoes either plunged straight to the bottom of the ocean, breached the surface like porpoises, ran erratically in circles, or, most infuriatingly, struck the hulls of Japanese cruisers and carriers with a dull, metallic thud, completely failing to explode due to highly defective magnetic and contact exploders. The problem was that the Mark 13 was an incredibly delicate, complex mechanism that could not handle the physical shock of hitting the water at the speeds and altitudes the Avenger was capable of flying. The official Navy doctrine dictated that the Avenger pilot had to decelerate to a dangerously slow 110 knots and drop the torpedo from an altitude of merely 50 feet. This forced the massive, relatively slow Avenger to fly a long, perfectly straight, suicidal path, making it an incredibly easy target for enemy gunners. The overcomplicated nature of the Avenger was being entirely negated by the fragility of its primary weapon. It was not until late 1943 and early 1944 that a team of civilian physicists and engineers at the California Institute of Technology, led by Charles Lauritsen, bypassed the stubborn naval bureaucracy and developed two seemingly simple, yet revolutionary modifications: the drag ring, or pickle barrel, placed over the nose of the torpedo to absorb the shock of water impact, and the plywood shroud ring fitted to the tail to stabilize its aerodynamic flight. These modifications completely transformed the tactical envelope of the Avenger. Pilots could now launch the heavily modified Mark 13 at speeds approaching 300 knots and from altitudes of up to 800 feet. The Avenger was suddenly liberated from the slow, suicidal, low-level approach. It could use its massive Wright R2600 twin Cyclone engine to dive violently out of the clouds, release its lethal payload with high-speed precision, and use its momentum to violently evade anti-aircraft fire, fundamentally altering the lethality of the American carrier strike groups. With a functional weapon finally matched to a highly survivable, over-engineered airframe, the Grumman Avenger rapidly evolved into the most devastating maritime weapon of the war, beginning its relentless accumulation of the highest surface kill ratio in history. As the massive American Fast Carrier Task Force began its island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, the Avenger proved to be a highly versatile, ruthlessly efficient platform. Its massive internal bomb bay, originally designed for the torpedo, allowed it to carry up to 2,000 pounds of conventional high-explosive bombs, depth charges, or highly destructive unguided aerial rockets mounted under the wings. During the massive carrier clashes of the Philippine Sea and the apocalyptic Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Avenger truly earned its reputation. The complexity of the Avenger's systems, specifically its advanced radio navigation equipment and primitive, newly developed airborne radar systems, allowed it to operate in terrible weather conditions and coordinate massive, multi-axis strikes. When American naval intelligence located the Japanese super battleship Musashi during the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, It was wave after wave of Avengers that absorbed the blistering, multicolored anti-aircraft fire from the massive ship, delivering an unrelenting barrage of 19 torpedo hits that finally sent the seemingly unsinkable, heavily armored Leviathan to the bottom of the ocean. Months later, during Operation 10 Go, Avengers repeated this horrific mathematical feat, swarming the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, striking it with at least 10 torpedoes predominantly on the port side, inducing a catastrophic list that resulted in a massive magazine explosion. The Avenger was not gracefully outmaneuvering its targets, it was utilizing its rugged, overcomplicated, redundant engineering to survive long enough in the most hostile environments imaginable to deliver crippling, war-winning blows. The complex powered turret, once derided as too heavy, proved invaluable during these massive fleet engagements, keeping aggressive Japanese fighters at bay and protecting the highly vulnerable tail of the aircraft as it pulled away from the drop zone. Simultaneously, while the Avenger was annihilating the Imperial Japanese Navy in the vast expanses of the Pacific, it was secretly fighting an equally critical, technologically complex war in the freezing, violent waters of the North Atlantic. The overcomplicated nature of the Avenger, specifically its massive payload capacity and its ability to carry a wide array of sophisticated electronic equipment, made it the absolute perfect platform for anti-submarine warfare. As the United States rushed dozens of small, slow escort carriers, the Jeep carriers, into service to close the mid-Atlantic gap and protect the vital logistical convoys traveling to Great Britain, the Avenger became the primary weapon against Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat wolfpacks. In this theater, the Avenger did not carry torpedoes, it carried highly complex, newly developed technologies. Avengers were fitted with early Aztec radar systems, their massive radomes protruding from the leading edge of the wing, capable of detecting the tiny conning tower of a surfaced U-boat at night or in heavy fog. They dropped sonobuoys, highly complex, disposable acoustic sensors that parachute dropped into the water to listen for the cavitation of submarine propellers, transmitting the data back to the Avenger's radioman. Most incredibly, the Avenger was the primary delivery platform for the Fido, the Mark 24 mine, which was entirely misnamed for secrecy purposes. The Fido was, in reality, the world's first operational autonomous acoustic homing torpedo. When an Avenger located a submerged U-boat using sonobuoys or the magnetic anomaly detector boom extending from its tail, the pilot would drop the highly sophisticated, battery-powered Fido. The small torpedo would autonomously spiral down through the depths, passively listening for the sound of the U-boat's propellers, correct its own course, and detonate against the submarine's hull. The complex integration of radar, sonar, acoustic weapons, and heavily armed depth charges transformed the Avenger from a mere strike aircraft into a highly autonomous, deeply sophisticated flying submarine hunter. Operating from the tiny, pitching decks of escort carriers like the USS Bogue, the USS Guadalcanal, and the USS Card in horrific Atlantic storms that would have grounded lesser aircraft, Avenger squadrons were directly responsible for sinking roughly 30 German and Japanese submarines, a staggering kill ratio that fundamentally broke the back of the Axis submarine menace and ensured the survival of the Allied logistical lifeline. The industrial capability required to produce this overcomplicated machine is a testament to the sheer manufacturing might of the United States. Recognizing that Grumman's own production lines on Long Island were stretched to the absolute breaking point, simultaneously producing the F-4F Wildcat, the F-6F Hellcat, and the Avenger, the United States government brokered an unprecedented industrial partnership. Production of the Avenger was licensed to the Eastern Aircraft Division of General Motors. General Motors took the highly complex, meticulously engineered Grumman blueprints and rapidly adapted them to mass production assembly line techniques originally designed for automobiles. The transition was incredibly difficult. Automotive engineers were initially baffled by the exacting tolerances, the complex hydraulic networks of the Santo wing, and the immense structural strength required of aeronautical engineering. However, the industrial might of General Motors eventually prevailed, and the company began producing the aircraft under the designation TBM. Astonishingly, General Motors ended up producing far more Avengers than Grumman itself, churning out over 7,500 TBMs compared to Grumman's 2,200 TBFs. This incredible volume of production ensured that every single American fleet carrier, light carrier, and escort carrier was constantly supplied with fresh, fully operational Avengers, overwhelming the Axis powers with a numerical superiority that completely negated whatever minor aerodynamic disadvantages the complex, heavy aircraft might have possessed. The human element of the Avenger's legacy is perhaps the most profound testament to its controversial design philosophy. Because Leroy Grumman prioritized heavy armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and massive, redundant structural spars over speed, the Avenger saved the lives of thousands of American aviators who would have undoubtedly perished in lighter, simpler aircraft. The massive, thick wings could absorb horrific punishment from 20mm cannons. The heavy radial engine could lose entire cylinders to flak and continue to run. The complex hydraulic systems had manual cable backups that allowed pilots to muscle a shattered aircraft back to the deck of a carrier. Perhaps the most famous testament to the Avenger's ruggedness is the combat experience of a young Navy lieutenant named George H.W. Bush. Flying a TBM Avenger from the light carrier USS San Jacinto, Bush was tasked with bombing a heavily defended radio transmission facility on the Japanese island of Chichijima. During his dive, his massive Avenger was struck by heavy anti-aircraft fire, causing the engine to catch fire and the cockpit to fill with blinding smoke. A lesser, simpler aircraft would have instantly disintegrated or lost all aerodynamic control. However, the over-engineered strength of the Avenger allowed Bush to complete his bombing run, drop his payload precisely on the target, and fly the burning, crippled Leviathan several miles out over the open ocean before the structural damage finally forced him to bail out, ultimately leading to his rescue by an American submarine. While tragically his two crewmates did not survive the bailout, the fact that the burning aircraft remained controllable long enough to complete the mission and clear the hostile island perfectly encapsulated the brutal, unyielding nature of the machine. To conclude that the Avenger was overcomplicated is fundamentally accurate in a purely mechanical sense. It possessed more moving parts, more hydraulic lines, more electrical wiring, and a more complex crew dynamic than almost any other single-engine aircraft of its era. However, to view that complexity as a detriment is a profound misunderstanding of naval warfare. The Avenger proved unequivocally that in the highly chaotic, massively destructive environment of the Second World War, simplicity was often a synonym for vulnerability. The Imperial Japanese Navy prioritized absolute simplicity, lightness, and aerodynamic purity in their aircraft, resulting in machines that performed beautifully at airshows but burned instantly when subjected to heavy combat. The American philosophy, embodied by the massive, heavy, highly complex Grumman Ironworks design, prioritized the delivery of overwhelming ordnance, the integration of advanced, heavy electronic sensors, and the absolute maximization of crew survivability. The highest kill ratio against surface vessels and submarines was not achieved by the fastest or the most agile aircraft. It was achieved by the most persistent, the most heavily armed, and the most difficult to kill. The Avenger was a flying contradiction, a bomber that handled like a truck but survived like a battleship, an aircraft dismissed by early critics as a bloated failure that ultimately outlived all of its contemporaries, continuing to serve in heavily modified, increasingly complex electronic warfare and anti-submarine roles well into the 1950s and the Korean War. The legacy of Leroy Grumman's masterpiece is a permanent historical vindication of the philosophy that in the brutal calculus of total war, calculated, intelligent over-engineering, while challenging to maintain and heavy to fly, is the ultimate guarantor of lethality and the absolute prerequisite for victory. The thousands of tons of Axis shipping resting at the bottom of the world's oceans serve as a silent, rusting testament to the devastating efficacy of the most perfectly overcomplicated torpedo bomber ever constructed.